Hello, I'm doing a book review, and the book I want to review is The Hobbit by J.R.R. Tolkien. Now, The Hobbit also goes by the title There and Back Again. Now, The Hobbit is a fantasy children's novel published in 1937, and it's considered to be one of the greatest fantasy novels ever written. Now, keep in mind, I'm not as familiar with Tolkien's work as other people might be. Like, The Hobbit so far is the only book I've read from him, and before reading this, the most I really knew about his work was through the Lord of the Rings movies. Now, The Hobbit is set in a world known as Middle-earth, which is a world inhabited by both humans and magical creatures like hobbits, wizards, dwarfs, elves, etc. Now, I always assumed that Middle-earth was supposed to be like an alternate universe, like a completely different world from our own, but apparently Middle-earth is actually supposed to be our world only thousands of years ago in a fictional period of time. So the plot of The Hobbit is it begins where a hobbit named Bilbo Baggins is visited by a wizard named Gandalf, who ends up bringing to his home a party of 13 dwarves, and it turns out that a long time ago these dwarfs once had a kingdom and had a very large treasure which was stolen from them by an evil dragon called Smaug, and now they want to go on a journey to reclaim their treasure and their kingdom and defeat Smaug, and now Gandalf is asking Bilbo if he wants to join them. Now Bilbo is hesitant to do this, and the dwarfs themselves are hesitant to even bring Bilbo with them because they think he's going to end up being more of a nuisance, and Gandalf is really the only reason they're bringing him with them, because Gandalf is telling the dwarfs that they're going to need Bilbo, but Bilbo himself doesn't even know why he's going to be needed. But what happens is they end up going on this journey, and along the way they end up facing off against things like trolls, goblins, giant spiders, and there's even a part in the story where Bilbo gets lost in this cave and he runs into a creature named Gollum and a magic ring, which would end up having an even bigger part to play in the sequel, The Lord of the Rings. But along the way, Bilbo ends up proving himself to the dwarfs and discovering courage he didn't even know he had. Now, The Hobbit definitely goes into a lot of different themes. Like, one of the themes in the book is the whole idea that we all possess the power to do great things whether we know it or not. Like, Bilbo does not think he'll be any use to the dwarfs, but he ends up being actually very much useful to them, and they end up giving him a lot of respect because of this, and as I said, he ends up discovering courage that he didn't even know he had. Another theme in the book is the concept of greed, and how greed blackens the soul. Like, in the book, when Bilbo runs into this creature Gollum, you realize that Gollum is obsessed with this magic ring, and you realize that the reason this creature may be the way it is because of this ring. Now, even though it's a magic ring, you could look at this as a metaphor for how greed corrupts a person, and even when Bilbo ends up being the one having to confront Smaug, you realize that Smaug himself is a victim of greed, because you realize that he's absolutely obsessed with this treasure which originally belonged to the dwarfs, and even the leader of the dwarfs, Thorin, he ends up becoming corrupted by his own greed towards the end of the book, which I don't want to give too much away about that, but really a lot of the book talks about how, once again, how greed corrupts the soul, and, you know, how greed undermines things like courage. Now, I really enjoyed The Hobbit. Now, even though this is intended as a children's novel, there are some scenes in this book which are actually pretty tense. Like, there's a scene in the book where Bilbo and the dwarfs get lost in this woods, and they end up getting attacked by these giant spiders, and the way the scene plays out, the scene would have fit very well in a horror novel. Also, another scene that I really like in the book is when Bilbo's lost in this cave and he runs into Gollum. Gollum tries eating Bilbo, but then they get into a riddle contest, and the deal is if Gollum gives Bilbo a riddle that he can't solve, Gollum will eat Bilbo, but if Bilbo gives Gollum a riddle that Gollum can't solve, Gollum has to lead Bilbo out of the cave, and it's actually really clever, some of the riddles they give each other, and once again, it's a pretty tense scene because you realize that if Bilbo loses this little riddle contest, Gollum will eat him. But yeah, The Hobbit is a very good book. I would definitely recommend it. Now, as I said, The Hobbit is considered to be one of the greatest fantasy novels ever written, and in the 50s, Tolkien published the three-part novel, The Lord of the Rings, which was a sequel to this book, and many people consider The Lord of the Rings to be superior to The Hobbit. And Tolkien ended up writing other stories which take place in Middle-earth. Now, both this and The Lord of the Rings were huge influences on many other fantasy novels which came after this. Like, you could see influences of this in the Harry Potter novels, and even author Stephen King took a lot of inspiration from this book and The Lord of the Rings, more so The Lord of the Rings with his books The Stand and the Dark Tower series. Now, in 1977, The Hobbit was made into a made-for-television animated film, and the year later there was an animated film based on Lord of the Rings, but perhaps the most famous adaptation of Tolkien's work is Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings trilogy, which is based on the sequel, The Lord of the Rings, and now Peter Jackson's coming out with the Hobbit trilogy, which all three films in the Hobbit trilogy are based on The Hobbit. Now, I will say I enjoyed the first two movies in the Hobbit trilogy. Obviously, the third film hasn't come out yet, but not for nothing, I really don't think The Hobbit needed to be a trilogy. Like, The Hobbit could have easily been made into one movie. I mean, with Lord of the Rings, it makes sense to make it a trilogy because that was already a three-part novel, but here they're making The Hobbit into a three-part series of films when The Hobbit was just one novel, so I really don't think The Hobbit needed to be made into a trilogy, but once again, I do think Peter Jackson's doing a pretty good job with those movies so far. Obviously, the third film hasn't come out yet. But yeah, that's my review on The Hobbit, or There and Back Again by J.R.R. Tolkien, and bye.